Blood washes off easier than guilt. Dominic Rousseau knew that better than anyone in this city. He sat in the faded diner, nursing black coffee and a lifetime of bad choices. Then, a tired waitress poured a fresh cup, her eyes locking onto his left hand. "Sir," she said, her voice barely louder than the rain hitting the glass. "My mother has a ring exactly like yours." In 30 years of running the underworld, Dominic had never frozen. Until now. The Red Star diner smelled of industrial bleach and burnt hash browns. It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions, mostly because the people who ate there at 3 in the morning didn't have answers worth hearing. Dominic sat in the back booth. The vinyl seat was duct-taped together, the adhesive peeling at the edges and sticking to the wool of his custom suit. He didn't care. He needed the quiet. Outside, the rain came down in sheets, blurring the neon sign in the window into a smeared red smudge against the Chicago dark. A black town car idled across the street. Inside it sat 2 men whose only job was to make sure Dominic breathed to see tomorrow. He ignored them. He ignored the damp ache in his left shoulder, a souvenir from a territory dispute in '98, and focused on the bitter sludge in his ceramic mug. He was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. It was a bone-deep exhaustion. The cynical weariness of a man who had spent 3 decades ordering violence and paying for it with pieces of his soul. A shadow fell over the table. More coffee? Dominic didn't look up. He just nudged the mug an inch forward. Chloe poured. Her feet throbbed. She was 6 hours into a double shift, her back aching in a way that made her feel 40 instead of 24. Her apron was stained with cherry syrup and grease. She didn't know who the man in the booth was, but she knew his type. The tailored dark suit, the immaculate haircut, the heavy silence. He was money, and he was danger. You didn't survive in this neighborhood without learning how to read the predators. Keep your head down, fill the cup, walk away. That was the rule. But as she tipped the glass pot, her gaze drifted down to the hand resting on the Formica table. It was a large hand, the knuckles thick and scarred. But it was the ring that caught her breath in her throat. It was a brutalist piece of jewelry, heavy, tarnished gold, setting a square onyx stone. But the stone was violently cracked right down the middle, the 2 halves held together by a crude, wire-thin band of melted silver. It looked like a mistake, a broken thing someone had forced back together. Chloe stopped pouring. The coffee steamed between them. She stared at the ring. The exact same jagged crack, the exact same silver wire. Dominic felt her pause. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. Men in his line of work didn't like sudden changes in rhythm. He finally looked up. His eyes were dark, flat, and devoid of warmth. He expected to see fear in the waitress's face. He expected her to apologize and scurry off. Instead, she was staring at his hand with a strange, pale intensity. "You're spilling it," Dominic said. His voice was gravel, low and scraping. Chloe jumped. A few drops of black coffee had splashed onto the table. She quickly grabbed a rag from her apron and wiped it up. "Sorry, I'm sorry." She hesitated. The smart thing to do was leave. Walk back behind the counter, count her tips, and go home to the eviction notice taped to her door. But she looked at the ring again. The words bypassed her brain entirely. "Sir," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "My mother has a ring exactly like yours." Dominic didn't move. He didn't blink. The silence that rushed into the booth was sudden and absolute. The clatter of plates from the kitchen seemed to fade out. The hum of the fluorescent lights vanished. There were only 2 of those rings in the world. He wore one. The other had burned in a tenement fire 25 years ago. He looked at the girl. Really looked at her this time. The cheap uniform hid her frame, but her face was striking. High cheekbones, a stubborn jawline, and her eyes. They were a piercing, turbulent grey. Dominic's lungs tightened. The air in the diner suddenly felt too thin to breathe. He slowly pulled his hand off the table, the gold scraping against the laminate. "What did you say?" he asked. The danger in his voice wasn't a threat. It was a plea. Chloe swallowed hard, suddenly acutely aware that she had stepped on a landmine. The man's demeanor had shifted. The casual indifference was gone, replaced by a coiled, suffocating intensity. Nothing. It's a stupid coincidence. Just forget it." She turned to leave. Dominic's hand shot out. He didn't grab her wrist. He knew better than to make a scene, but he blocked her path with his arm. "Don't walk away," he commanded. It was an order from a man who had never been told no. "Your mother. What is her name?" Chloe's pulse hammered in her throat. She stepped back, bumping into the adjacent booth. "Let me go to work, sir." "Her name," Dominic repeated. His chest physically ached. A ghost had just walked into the Red Star diner and poured him a cup of coffee. He stared at the grey eyes. God, those eyes. "Catherine," Chloe blurted out, her defensive instincts flaring. "Her name is Catherine. Now, I have tables to bus." She spun around and practically fled to the safety of the kitchen, swinging doors. Dominic watched her go. The grey eyes. The name. Catherine. He looked down at his right hand. The cracked onyx stared back at him. For 25 years he believed she was dead. He had buried an empty casket because his father told him the fire had left nothing behind. He had burned half of Chicago to the ground in retaliation. He had built an empire on the ashes of his grief. Dominic reached into his jacket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and left it beside the half-empty mug. He slid out of the booth. He didn't feel the ache in his shoulder anymore. He didn't feel the damp chill of the diner. He walked out into the rain. The town car's headlights flicked on. He opened the back door and slid into the leather interior. Gabe, his driver and closest confidant, looked at him through the rearview mirror. "Everything all right, boss?" "The waitress," Dominic said, his voice barely holding together. "Find out everything. Where she lives, who she owes, and find her mother. Tonight." The ride back to the estate was silent. The tires hissed against the wet asphalt of the interstate, a steady, hypnotic sound that usually calmed Dominic. Tonight, it sounded like a ticking clock. He poured himself a glass of scotch from the crystal decanter, built into the armrest. But he didn't drink it. He just held the heavy glass, rolling it between his palms, feeling the cold condensation. Catherine. The name felt like a rusted blade turning in his gut. 1999. He was 23, the heir to the Russo family, suffocating under the weight of a violent legacy he hadn't asked for, but was born to rule. She was a florist in the South Side. No family connections, no money. She had laughed at his expensive suits and told him his car was too flashy. She hadn't cared about his last name. For 8 months, she was the only real thing in a world built on lies and blood money. Then came the night he told his father he was walking away. He was going to marry her. He had taken a hammer to his grandfather's signet ring, splitting the onyx in half, binding the broken pieces with silver. He kept one. He gave her the other. A promise that no matter how fractured they were, they held together. 3 days later, her apartment building went up in flames. His father's enforcers made sure the fire escapes were chained. Dominic closed his eyes. The memory of the heat still scorched his throat. He had taken the family throne by putting a bullet in the men who set the fire, and he had sent his own father into a forced, permanent exile. But none of it brought her back. Until tonight. Across the city, Chloe pushed open the heavy front door of her apartment building. The lock had been broken for 3 months. The hallway smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and old cigarette smoke. She climbed 4 flights of stairs, her legs burning with every step, and unlocked apartment 4B. The door clicked shut behind her. The cramped living room was cast in the blue glow of a muted television. In the corner, an oxygen concentrator hummed its rhythmic, wheezing tune. "Mom!" Chloe called out softly, dropping her keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. "In here, sweetheart." The voice was frail, thinned out by years of sickness and working on factory floors with terrible ventilation. Chloe walked into the small bedroom. Catherine was propped up on worn pillows. Her hair, once a vibrant dark brown, was streaked heavily with grey. Her skin was pale, but her eyes, the exact same grey as her daughter's, still held a sharp, stubborn light. "You're up late," Chloe said, sinking onto the edge of the mattress. She pulled off her sneakers, wincing as her arches cramped. "Couldn't sleep. How was the shift?" "Long. Tips were garbage." Chloe rubbed her temples. The image of the man in the booth flashed in her mind. The heavy gold, the cracked stone. She looked over at the small wooden jewelry box sitting on Catherine's nightstand. "Mom, what is it, Chloe?" "That ring you have. The broken one you keep locked up. Where did you get it?" The oxygen machine hummed. For a second, that was the only sound in the room. Catherine's hand, thin and trembling, gripped the edge of the blanket. The color entirely drained from her face. "Why are you asking about that?" Catherine's voice was suddenly tight, stripped of its usual warmth. "I saw a guy tonight at the diner. Rich guy, scary. He had a ring exactly like it. Same crack in the stone, same silver wire. I told him you had one." Catherine sat up. The plastic tubing of her oxygen cannula snagged on the pillow. "You told him?" Panic, raw and undisguised, fractured her voice. "Chloe, what did you tell him? Did you tell him your name?" "No. I mean, I just said my mother had one. He asked your name. I said Catherine. Mum, you're scaring me. What's going on? We have to pack." Catherine threw the blanket off. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out, and she slumped back onto the mattress, coughing violently. "Grab the duffel bag from the closet. Just clothes. Nothing else." "Mum, stop!" Chloe grabbed her mother's shoulders. "We can't go anywhere. You can barely walk, and we have $34 to our name. Who was that man?" Catherine looked at her daughter, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "He's the reason we have $34, Chloe. He's the reason we've been hiding since before you were born." 30 miles away, in the sprawling library of the Russo estate, Dominic stood by the fireplace. The flames cast long, dancing shadows against the mahogany walls. The heavy oak doors clicked open. Gabe walked in. He held a thin manila folder. He didn't look at Dominic. He just set the folder on the leather desk. "It didn't take long," Gabe said quietly. "Digital footprint is small, but it's there. The waitress is Chloe Adams, 24 years old, born August 12th, 2000. Dominic didn't breathe. He did the math. August 2000. 9 months after the fire. Mother is Catherine Adams," Gabe continued, his voice devoid of inflection. "Maiden name erased, but the social security number traces back to a dead file from 1999. They live in a walk-up in Pilsen. She's drowning in medical debt. Emphysema. She doesn't have long." Dominic walked over to the desk. His hands were shaking. The boss of the Chicago syndicate, a man who had ordered executions over breakfast, could barely open a cardboard folder. He flipped the cover back. A DMV photo stared back at him. It was an older, tired version of the woman he had loved. But it was her, Catherine, alive, and she had a 24-year-old daughter. Dominic looked at the birth date again. August 12th. He traced the numbers with his finger. "Get the car ready," Dominic whispered. "Boss, it's 4 a.m. If we roll into Pilsen now—" "Get the car ready, Gabe," Dominic said, looking up. The exhaustion was gone from his eyes. In its place was a terrifying, violent clarity. "I'm going to see my daughter." The rain had turned the streets of Pilsen into slick, black mirrors. Dominic's town car glided to a halt in front of a crumbling brick building. A flickering streetlight cast harsh yellow shadows across the facade. The front door was propped open with a waterlogged phone book. It was a place designed for people the city had forgotten. Dominic stepped out into the downpour. He didn't wait for Gabe to open his umbrella. The cold water hit his face, soaking into his collar, but he barely registered the chill. He stared at the 4-story structure. The anger inside him was a living thing, thrashing against his ribs. Anger at his dead father. Anger at the lost years. But mostly a paralyzing, suffocating terror that he was going to walk up those stairs and find it was all a lie. "Keep the engine running," Dominic said. Gabe nodded, standing by the open driver's door. His hand hovered casually near the inside of his jacket. "You want me to sweep the building, boss?" "No, I go alone." Dominic crossed the cracked sidewalk and entered the stairwell. It smelled of stale beer and damp plaster. The overhead light buzzed, throwing off a sickly fluorescent flicker. He began to climb. His heavy leather shoes made no sound on the concrete. First floor, second floor. The damp ache in his shoulder flared up, a dull throb matching his heartbeat. Third floor. He reached the 4th-floor landing. Apartment 4B. The door was thin, the wood splintered around a cheap deadbolt that looked like it could be kicked in by a stiff breeze. Inside the apartment, panic was suffocating the small room. Chloe shoved faded sweaters into a canvas duffel bag on the floor. Her hands shook violently. She kept glancing at her mother, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face grey, clutching the oxygen mask over her nose and mouth. The machine chugged, working overtime to pump air into Catherine's ruined lungs. "Just a few more things, Mom. I've got the medicine. I've got the cash tip from tonight." Chloe's voice was high, frantic. "We'll go to Sarah's place in Gary. She won't ask questions. We just need to get on a bus." Catherine pulled the mask away. "Chloe, stop." Her voice was a wet rasp. "You don't understand who he is. If he knows, if he sent his men, he doesn't know where we live," Chloe snapped, zipping the bag with unnecessary force. "I didn't tell him anything. Let's just go." A heavy, deliberate knock echoed through the apartment. Chloe froze. The blood drained from her extremities. The zipper slipped from her fingers. Catherine let out a choked sob, pressing a hand to her mouth. 3 sharp knocks. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't the landlord. The sound carried authority. It was the sound of a man who owned the door, the building, and the air inside it. Chloe backed into the kitchen alcove. Her hand blindly reached backward, her fingers wrapping around the handle of a serrated bread knife resting by the sink. She pulled it close to her thigh, her knuckles turning white. She walked slowly to the door. She didn't look through the peephole. She didn't need to. She turned the deadbolt. It clicked, loud as a gunshot in the silent hallway. She opened the door 2 inches, keeping her foot wedged against the baseboard. Dominic stood in the dim hallway. His suit was dark with rain. His hair, normally perfectly swept back, hung loose over his forehead. He didn't look like the cold, terrifying predator from the diner anymore. He looked shattered. His eyes locked onto Chloe's, the grey eyes, the stubborn jaw. "Move away from the door, Chloe," Dominic said. His voice was devastatingly quiet. "Get out of here," Chloe snarled, her voice trembling but fierce. "I have a phone. I'll call the cops." "We both know the cops don't come to this neighborhood in under an hour," Dominic said gently. He didn't push against the wood. He just stood there, letting her see his empty hands. "And we both know you don't want them here anyway." "Put the knife down." Chloe blinked, looking down at her hand. She hadn't realized he could see the reflection of the blade in the hall mirror. "Dominic." The voice came from the bedroom. It was frail, broken, but it hit Dominic with the force of a freight train. He pushed the door. Chloe braced her leg, but she was entirely outmatched by his sheer physical weight. The door swung open, forcing her to stumble backward. Dominic stepped over the threshold, ignoring the knife in her hand. He didn't care if she stabbed him. He wouldn't have felt it. He walked slowly past the cramped kitchenette, past the peeling wallpaper, and stopped in the doorway of the bedroom. Catherine sat on the mattress, 25 years dissolved in a single agonizing heartbeat. She looked so small. The vibrant, laughing girl who used to steal his expensive lighters and throw them in the river was gone. In her place was a woman hollowed out by time and sickness. But it was her. The curve of her neck, the familiar shape of her hands resting on the thin blanket. Dominic's knees felt like water. For a man who dictated life and death across 3 states, he suddenly forgot how to stand. He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, his chest heaving as he took in a ragged breath. "Catherine," he breathed. The name scraped against his throat. Catherine looked at him. Tears cut through the exhaustion on her face. She didn't look angry. She just looked incredibly tired. "You found us. I buried you," Dominic whispered, his voice cracking. "There was a casket. Ashes. My father told me." "He told you what you needed to hear so you would take the ring," Catherine interrupted softly. A violent cough shook her frame. She reached for the mask, taking a deep drag of oxygen before pulling it away. And it worked. Chloe stood in the hallway, the knife lowering slightly as she stared at the scene unfolding. The terrifying man from the diner was crying. Silent, heavy tears mixed with the rain on his face. Dominic stepped into the room. He walked to the edge of the bed and dropped to his knees on the cheap linoleum floor. The ruined gold ring on his left hand gleamed in the dim light. He reached out, his large, scarred hand hovering inches from hers, terrified that if he touched her, she would turn into smoke and vanish again. "Why didn't you come back?" he asked. The question was a bleeding wound. "I tore the city apart, looking for whoever did it. I killed them all. I would have burned the world down for you. Why did you stay dead?" Catherine looked past him, her eyes settling on her daughter, standing in the doorway. "Because," Catherine said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "I had to protect her from the ashes." Dominic slowly turned his head. He looked at Chloe. Really looked at her. In the diner, he had seen a reflection of Catherine. Now, in the stark, unforgiving light of the apartment, he saw the rest of it. He saw the dark, heavy brow that mirrored his own. He saw the tall, imposing frame hidden beneath the oversized flannel shirt. He did the math again, though his heart already knew the answer. 24 years old. "She's mine," Dominic said. It wasn't a question. It was an earth-shattering realization that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the room. "Her name is Chloe," Catherine said, her grip tightening on the blanket. "And she is mine, not yours. Never yours." Chloe dropped the knife. It clattered against the linoleum, a harsh, metallic sound that broke the spell in the room. She backed away, hitting the wall of the hallway. Her breathing turned shallow and rapid. "What is she talking about? Mom, what is he talking about?" "I was 2 months pregnant when the building burned," Catherine said, her eyes fixed on Dominic, completely ignoring Chloe's panic. The fear that had paralyzed her earlier was burning away, replaced by the fierce, territorial instinct of a mother cornered. "Your father's men didn't just lock the fire escapes, Dominic. They came to my door first. They told me that I was a distraction, a liability. They told me that if I didn't disappear, the next fire would happen while you were sleeping beside me." Dominic flinched, as if he had been struck with a crowbar. "He knew." Dominic's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "My father knew you were pregnant. He suspected, and he made it clear that the Russo family didn't tolerate bastards from Southside florists." Catherine coughed again, a deep, rattling sound that went on for too long. She pressed a tissue to her mouth, and when she pulled it away, Dominic saw the faint smear of blood. "I climbed down the alley fire escape before the smoke got too thick. I ran. I changed my name. I scrubbed toilets and sewed in sweatshops because the poverty was safer than your money. I would have protected you," Dominic pleaded, his voice breaking. He was still on his knees. "I took the family over. I banished him. I had the power." "You didn't have the power then," Catherine fired back, her voice finding a sudden, desperate strength. "You were a boy playing in a graveyard. If I had stayed, they would have killed us both. And even if you protected us, what kind of life is that? I wasn't going to raise my daughter behind 10-foot gates with armed guards. I wasn't going to let her watch her father wash blood off his hands before he held her." The words hit their mark. Dominic looked down at his hands, the scars, the cracked ring. She was right. The empire he built to avenge her would have consumed their child anyway. "I'm right here!" Chloe shouted. She stepped forward, her hands balled into fists. "Stop talking about me like I'm not in the room. You—" She pointed a shaking finger at Dominic. "You're my father." Dominic looked up at her. He didn't know how to speak to a daughter. He only knew how to give orders, how to negotiate, how to threaten. But looking at the fierce, terrified girl in front of him, all his instincts failed. "Yes," Dominic said simply. Chloe let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "No, absolutely not. My father died before I was born. He was a salesman. That's what she told me." "I lied, Chloe," Catherine whispered. "I lied to keep you alive. So this guy in a suit who leaves $100 tips and drives a car worth more than this entire block. He's just going to walk in here, and what? Play dad?" Chloe's eyes burned with angry tears. She looked at Dominic with raw disgust. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to walk into this dump and pretend you care. We don't need you. You're struggling to breathe," Dominic said, his gaze shifting back to Catherine, taking in the bruised skin under her eyes, the hollow cheeks. "You're dying." "Emphysema," Catherine stated flatly. "It's a working-class disease. You get it from breathing in garment factory dust for 20 years. I don't want your pity." Dominic stood up. The vulnerability that had brought him to his knees vanished, replaced by the cold, calculated efficiency of the man who ran Chicago. He reached into his coat and pulled out his phone. "What are you doing?" Chloe demanded, stepping between him and the bed. "I'm fixing this," Dominic said. He dialed a number and put the phone to his ear. "Gabe, bring the car around to the alley. Call Dr. Aris. Tell him to prep the private suite at St. Jude's. Full pulmonary team waiting. We're moving in 10 minutes. He hung up. "We aren't going anywhere with you," Chloe said, standing her ground. She was terrified, but she didn't flinch. She had her mother's spine. "Your mother is drowning in her own lungs, Chloe," Dominic said, his voice hard, though his eyes betrayed his panic. She needs specialized care. Care that costs more in a day than you make in a year at that diner. I can give it to her. I can buy her time. I can buy her comfort. With blood money? Catherine asked weakly from the bed. With whatever it takes, Dominic answered, looking over Chloe's shoulder to meet Catherine's eyes. I lost you once. I spent 25 years living in a grave because I thought you were in one. I am not leaving this room without you. He looked back at Chloe. You can hate me. You can despise me. You can take that knife and stick it in my ribs right now, and I won't lift a finger to stop you. But you are not going to let your mother die in this damp room out of pride. Chloe's mouth opened to argue, but she had nothing left. She looked at the peeling wallpaper. She looked at the oxygen tank that was constantly failing. She looked at her mother, who was shivering despite the blankets. Chloe swallowed the bitter pill of reality. If you hurt her, I would burn myself alive first, Dominic swore. For the first time in her life, Chloe looked at the Mafia boss and believed him. She turned around and grabbed the packed duffel bag. 10 minutes, Chloe muttered, wiping roughly at her eyes. Let's get her coat. The private loading dock at St. Jude's Medical Center was completely deserted. It was heavily lit, a sterile expanse of white concrete that smelled of ozone and bleach. The town car didn't stop at the emergency room entrance. It rolled past the ambulances and slipped behind a rolling steel gate that Gabe had opened with a remote on the visor. Dominic stepped out before the car had fully stopped. He opened the rear door. Catherine was leaning against the plush leather, her breathing a shallow, wet rattle that terrified him more than any gun ever had. Before Chloe could unbuckle her mother, the double steel doors of the hospital swung open. A gurney rolled out, pushed by 4 people in navy blue scrubs. Leading them was an older man in a tailored white coat. Dr. Aris. Get her on the oxygen, Aris barked, not bothering with pleasantries. He took one look at Catherine's grey skin and the blue tint of her lips. Her sats are crashing. Push 50 milligrams of solumedrol stat. Get a line in. They moved with practiced, terrifying efficiency. Chloe was pushed aside. She stumbled on the slick concrete, clutching the cheap canvas duffel bag to her chest. She watched as strangers lifted her mother onto the stretcher, stripping away the failing portable tank and replacing it with heavy professional equipment. They rushed through the doors. Dominic followed them, his stride long and relentless. Chloe ran to keep up. They didn't go to the emergency room. They took a private service elevator up to the 12th floor. The doors slid open to reveal a quiet, carpeted hallway that looked more like a luxury hotel than a hospital. There were no crying children, no crowded waiting rooms, no smell of cheap cafeteria food. Just original artwork on the walls and the low, steady hum of central air. The nurses wheeled Catherine into a massive suite at the end of the hall. The door shut. Chloe slammed her hand against the heavy wood, trying to follow. Hold on, Dominic said. He caught her wrist. His grip was firm, but he didn't squeeze. He just anchored her. Let them work. Let me go, Chloe yelled, her voice cracking. She ripped her arm away. The adrenaline of the last hour was finally burning out, leaving behind a cold, hollow panic. She spun on him. Who are these people? Why didn't we go to the ER? You can't just bypass a whole hospital. I built this wing, Dominic said. The truth was delivered without pride, flat and cold. 10 years ago, I fund the oncology department and the pulmonary center. In exchange, the 12th floor belongs to me. No paperwork, no questions. When my people get hurt, this is where they come. Chloe stared at him. The sheer scale of the power this man wielded was starting to crush her. She had spent her entire life calculating the cost of a gallon of milk. She had skipped meals so her mother could afford generic inhalers. She was standing in a hospital wing owned by a phantom. "You're a mobster," she whispered. The word sounded ridiculous out loud, like something from a movie, but the heavy silence of the 12th floor made it chillingly real. "I'm a businessman," Dominic corrected quietly, "but the business is violent." He walked over to a leather sofa in the waiting alcove and sat down. He looked at his hands. For a long time, the only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Chloe didn't sit. She paced. Her cheap sneakers squeaked against the polished floorboards. She watched the closed door of the suite, waiting for someone to come out and tell her it was too late. "You said your father was a salesman," Dominic said softly, breaking the silence. Chloe stopped pacing. She glared at him. "He was. In my head, he was a guy who sold life insurance. He traveled a lot. He died in a car crash on I-90 before I was born. That's the story I got. That's the man I grieved." "I'm sorry," Dominic said. "Don't do that." Chloe pointed a finger at him, her grey eyes flashing with a sudden, vicious anger. "Don't apologize to me. You don't get to act like a victim. My mother hid in a roach-infested apartment for 24 years because of your family. Because of you. You want to know what it was like? I used to do my homework in the bathtub because it was the only place safe from stray bullets." She coughed up blood on her birthdays and smiled and told me it was just allergies. Dominic didn't flinch. He took the verbal beating because he knew he deserved every single word of it. "I thought she was dead, Chloe." "And if you had known she was alive?" Chloe fired back. "What then? You bring us into this. You make us a part of your violent business? We would have just been targets. She made the right choice." The door to the suite clicked open. Dr. Aris stepped out. He looked tired. He pulled the stethoscope from his neck and shoved it into his pocket. Dominic stood up immediately. "She's stabilized," Aris said, addressing Dominic directly, a habit born of years on his payroll. "Her oxygen saturation is back in the low 90s. But Dom, her lungs are severely compromised. The tissue is scarred beyond repair. We can manage the symptoms, we can keep her comfortable, but the damage is done." "How long?" Dominic asked. His voice was steady, betraying none of the absolute terror ripping through his chest. Aris looked at Chloe, then back to Dominic. "Weeks, maybe a couple of months if she fights. But you need to manage your expectations." Dominic nodded slowly. He looked past the doctor, staring at the closed door. A few months. He had lost 25 years, and fate was handing him a few weeks of borrowed time. It felt like a cruel, calculated joke. 2 days passed in a blur of sterile silence. The rain over Chicago finally broke, leaving behind a cold, biting wind. Inside Suite 1204, the temperature was strictly controlled. Catherine slept mostly. The cocktail of steroids and painkillers Aris pumped into her IV line kept the brutal coughing fits at bay, but they left her drifting in and out of a heavy fog. Dominic rarely left the room. He sat in a high-backed armchair by the window, watching the monitors beep. He handled his empire through hushed phone calls in the hallway. The syndicate was growing restless. Gabe stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the light from the hall. He kept his voice low. "Boss, the capos are asking questions. You missed the sit-down with the Moretti crew yesterday. Now you've cancelled the dockyard inspection." Dominic rubbed his face, feeling the rough stubble along his jaw. "Let them ask. It's not just whispers anymore," Gabe pressed. "Word is leaking that you've practically moved into St. Jude's. People are wondering if you're sick, or worse, if you're going soft. The Morettis are looking for any excuse to renegotiate the South Side ports, if they think you're distracted." "I'll handle Moretti," Dominic snapped. his tone finally carrying the lethal edge of a boss. "Keep a perimeter on this floor. 4 men at the elevators, 2 in the stairwells. Nobody comes up here unless they have my blood type or Oris's badge. You understand?" "Got it." Gabe hesitated. "What about the girl?" Dominic looked toward the small adjacent resting room. The door was cracked open. Chloe was asleep on a cot, utterly exhausted from a lifetime of hypervigilance. "She's off limits to the world," Dominic said. "Scrub her digital footprint, erase the apartment lease. Anyone goes looking for Chloe Adams, they find smoke." Gabe nodded and disappeared down the hall. Dominic walked back to the armchair. As he sat down, he heard the rustle of sheets. Catherine's eyes were open. They were clear today. The grey was sharp, stripped of the narcotic haze. She looked around the massive suite, taking in the mahogany trim, the private bathroom, the view of the Chicago skyline. "It's a nice cage," she whispered. Her voice was weak, but the rasp was gone. Dominic leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's not a cage, Cat. It's a fortress." "Same thing," she replied, turning her head on the pillow to look at him. She studied his face, the grey hair at his temples, the deep lines carved into his forehead. "You look older." "I feel older." Dominic reached out. He hesitated, then gently covered her frail, ivy-bruised hand with his own. He braced himself for her to pull away. She didn't. "She hates you," Catherine said quietly. "I know. She doesn't understand your world, Dom. She only understands survival. She knows how to count pennies and stretch a pot of soup for 3 days. She doesn't know how to navigate bulletproof glass and armed guards." "She won't have to," Dominic said fiercely. "I'll protect her." Catherine offered a sad, thin smile. "You can't. That's the tragedy of your life, Dominic. Your protection is exactly what puts a target on her back. The moment the city finds out you have an heir, a weakness, they will tear her apart to get to you." The words hit him like physical blows, largely because he knew she was absolutely right. He had spent his life ruthlessly exploiting the weaknesses of other men. Wives, children, brothers. In the syndicate, love was a luxury you couldn't afford because love was leverage. "I'll burn the city down before I let them touch her," Dominic swore. "You already burned it down once for me," Catherine reminded him. "And what did it get us? 25 years apart, a pile of ashes." She squeezed his fingers. Her grip was incredibly weak, but the weight behind it was massive. "You can't fix this with violence," she said, her breathing growing slightly labored. "And you can't buy me a new set of lungs. Your money, your power, it ends right at the edge of this bed." Dominic looked down. The broken onyx ring on his hand caught the morning light. "Then tell me what to do. Tell me how to make it right. Because I am drowning here, Cat. I found you, and now I just have to watch you die." You let her go. Dominic's head snapped up. "When I am gone," Catherine continued, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce, uncompromising clarity. "You give her enough money to vanish. You get her out of Chicago. You erase her name, and you never, ever contact her again." "No," the word tore out of Dominic's throat. "She's my daughter." "She is a civilian," Catherine fired back, coughing weakly. "She is a waitress who deserves a normal life. She deserves a husband who doesn't carry a gun, and children who don't have to check under their cars for bombs. You owe me, Dominic Russo. You owe me for the life your family stole from us." She was right. The guilt was an ocean, and he was sinking to the bottom of it. "You want me to just let her walk away?" Dominic whispered, the reality of the demand crushing his chest. "I want you to be a father," Catherine said softly, her anger fading back into exhaustion. And for a man in your position, being a father means being a ghost. Dominic stared at the woman he loved. He felt the cold truth of her words settling into his bones. He had spent his entire life taking things by force, territory, respect, blood. But the only way to save his daughter was to do the one thing he had never done. He had to surrender. The 12th floor of St. Jude's became a purgatory of polished wood and muted alarms. 3 weeks bled into 4. Outside, the Chicago autumn turned brutal, stripping the trees bare and freezing the rain before it hit the pavement. Inside Suite 1204, time was measured strictly by the slow, agonizing intervals of Catherine's breathing. Chloe stopped leaving the floor. She lived in the oversized scrubs the nurses provided, her hair tied in a messy knot, subsisting on black coffee and protein bars Gabe quietly left on the counter. She watched Dominic. She studied him the way a person studies an unexploded bomb. She saw the terrifying duality of the man. In the mornings, he sat by Catherine's bed. He read to her from worn paperbacks, Hemingway, Steinbeck, his rough, gravelly voice dropping to a low, soothing cadence. He wiped the sweat from her forehead with a damp cloth. He held her hand for hours, his thumb gently tracing the blue veins on her wrist. In those moments, Chloe saw the 23-year-old boy who had taken a hammer to a gold ring for love. But then the door would close, and Dominic would step into the hallway. Chloe saw that too. She stood in the shadow of the resting room and listened. She watched him take meetings with broad-shouldered men in tailored coats. She heard the cold, dead pitch of his voice when he issued orders. "Moretti hit the South Side docks," Gabe reported one Tuesday evening, his voice a low rumble. "Burned 2 shipments. He sent a message, boss. Said he hears the king is bleeding out in a hospital bed." Dominic didn't blink. He just adjusted his cuffs. "Find the men who lit the match. Take their hands. Leave them on Moretti's front porch in a cardboard box. If he wants a war, he can start by burying his own." Chloe had clamped her hands over her mouth, her stomach heaving. "Take their hands!" The command was delivered with the casual indifference of ordering lunch. Dominic turned and caught her staring through the cracked door. The absolute zero in his eyes slowly thawed, replaced by a heavy, suffocating shame. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to explain. He just turned his back and walked away down the corridor. By the 5th week, Catherine's lungs began to fail entirely. Dr. Aris stopped talking about weeks. He started talking about hours. It was a Tuesday night, exactly at 3 in the morning, the same time Chloe used to pour coffee at the Red Star Diner. The suite was cast in the dim, blue glow of the monitoring equipment. The oxygen concentrator worked furiously, but it was a losing battle against the ruined, scarred tissue in Catherine's chest. Catherine shifted. The rustle of the sheets sounded incredibly loud. Dominic was instantly out of his chair, leaning over the rail. Chloe rushed in from the adjoining room, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She grabbed her mother's other hand. "Cat," Dominic whispered. His voice broke. The Mafia boss, the man who ordered amputations over a burned shipment, was trembling violently. Catherine didn't look at him. Her grey eyes, clouded and tired, sought out her daughter. She squeezed Chloe's fingers. There was no strength left in the grip, just the desperate phantom of it. "Don't carry it," Catherine gasped, the words fighting through the plastic mask. "Mum, please don't talk. Just rest," Chloe sobbed, tears spilling over her cheeks, dripping onto the pristine hospital sheets. "Don't carry the anger, Chloe." Catherine forced the words out, her chest heaving with the terrible effort. "Live. Just live." She turned her head an inch. She looked at Dominic. She didn't have the breath to speak again, but the demand in her eyes was absolute. "Remember your promise." Dominic nodded once. A single, jagged movement. Catherine's eyes drifted back to the ceiling. The harsh, rattling sound of her breathing slowed. The agonizing struggle in her chest suddenly stopped. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't a grand exit. It was simply a tired engine finally running out of fuel. The monitor beside the bed let out a long, flat, continuous tone. Chloe collapsed against the mattress, burying her face in the blankets, letting out a raw, guttural wail that tore through the sterile silence of the suite. Dominic didn't make a sound. He stood perfectly still, his hand still covering Catherine's. He felt the warmth slowly begin to leave her skin. He looked at the cracked onyx ring on his finger. The silver wire held the stone together, but the man wearing it was completely destroyed. He slowly let go of her hand. He stepped back. He looked at Chloe, crumpled and sobbing over her mother's body. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to pull her into his arms, to hold his daughter, to tell her he would protect her. Instead, he turned around and walked out of the room. He closed the heavy wooden door behind him, sealing the grief inside. He leaned against the hallway wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. He put his head in his hands and wept in absolute, crushing silence. The funeral was a ghost town. They buried Catherine in a private cemetery on the edge of the city, under a canopy of ancient oaks. There was no priest. There were no mourners. Just the heavy, grey sky, the freshly turned earth, and 3 living souls. Chloe stood in a black wool coat Dominic had bought for her. The wind whipped her dark hair across her pale face. She stared at the polished mahogany casket resting on the lowering straps. She felt hollowed out, as if her own lungs had collapsed the night her mother died. Dominic stood 10 feet away. He wore a heavy black overcoat. Gabe stood a few paces behind him, a silent sentinel holding a dark umbrella. Nobody spoke as the casket was lowered into the ground. When it was done, the cemetery workers stepped forward with their shovels. Chloe turned away. She couldn't watch the dirt hit the wood. She walked toward the idling town car parked on the gravel path. Dominic followed her. Before she could open the door, he stepped in front of her. He held a thick, heavy leather briefcase. "What is this?" Chloe asked, her voice raspy from crying. "Your way out," Dominic said. He didn't look her in the eye. He looked at the collar of her coat. Inside are a new passport, a driver's license, and a birth certificate. The name is Claire Bennett. There's a deed to a house in a quiet town in Oregon. The taxes are paid for the next 20 years. Chloe stared at the briefcase. Her chest tightened. "There's also an account number," Dominic continued, his voice devoid of any emotion. He sounded like a lawyer reading a will. "The routing goes through 3 offshore holding companies. It's entirely untraceable. There is enough money in there that you will never have to pour another cup of coffee or look at a price tag for the rest of your life." He held the handle out to her. Chloe didn't take it. She looked at his face, the deep lines, the terrifying flat darkness in his eyes. "You're sending me away," she whispered. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had spent the last month hating him, resenting his intrusion into their lives. But standing in the graveyard, completely alone in the world, the thought of him abandoning her terrified her. "I am keeping my promise to your mother," Dominic said softly. "She asked me to give you a normal life. This is the only way." "I don't know anyone in Oregon," Chloe said, her voice cracking. Panic flared in her chest. "I don't know how to be Claire Bennett. I just buried my mother. You're my father. You can't just hand me a briefcase and disappear." "I have to," Dominic said. The iron control in his voice finally slipped, revealing the bleeding wound underneath. He looked her directly in the eye. "Chloe, look at me," Look at the men waiting in the cars down the hill. Look at this life. If you stay in Chicago, if the families find out you exist, you become leverage. You become a target. My world is built on violence, and it will drown you just like it drowned her. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. He gently took her hand and pressed the heavy leather handle of the briefcase into her palm. "I cannot lose you twice," Dominic whispered. "To be your father, I have to be a ghost. You take this. You get on the private plane, waiting at O'Hare, and you never look back. If you ever see me again, it means I failed." Chloe's grip tightened on the handle. Tears blurred her vision. She hated him for the logic. She hated him for being right. "Will I ever know what happens to you?" "No," Dominic lied. He knew exactly what was going to happen to him. A sharp crunch of gravel broke the moment. Gabe was jogging up the path, his umbrella cast aside. His face was grim. "Boss," Gabe breathed heavily as he reached them. He glanced nervously at Chloe. "We have a problem. A big one. Moretti's people just hit the estate. They bypassed the outer gates. And word just came down. Somebody on the 12th floor talked. Moretti knows about the girl." The blood drained from Dominic's face. The quiet, tragic handover he had planned shattered into 1,000 pieces. "They know she's your daughter," Gabe said, his hand hovering over his sidearm. "They have spotters on the cemetery gates right now. We are boxed in." Chloe felt the world tilt. The abstract threat her mother had warned her about was suddenly a violent, breathing reality. She looked at Dominic. The grief in the mob boss's eyes vanished, replaced instantly by absolute, unhinged violence. The monster Chloe had seen in the hospital hallway returned, but this time it was unchained. Dominic reached under his heavy overcoat. He pulled out a black, suppressed, Sig Sauer handgun. He chambered around. The metallic click was deafening in the quiet graveyard. "Take the briefcase," Dominic ordered Chloe, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying authority. He turned to his driver. "Gabe, you put her in the floorboards of the car. You drive through the south gate. Do not stop for anything. You get her to that plane." "Boss, I'm not leaving you here without backup," Gabe argued. "You will do exactly as I say," Dominic roared, the sound echoing off the gravestones. He looked back at Chloe. "Go. Now. What are you going to do?" Chloe yelled over the sudden roar of the town car's engine as Gabe remote started it. Dominic looked down the hill toward the iron gates of the cemetery. He saw the black SUVs pulling up, blocking the exit. He looked down at his left hand, the cracked onyx ring. "I'm going to buy you a head start," Dominic said. Gabe didn't hesitate. He grabbed Chloe by the collar of her wool coat and shoved her violently into the back of the armored town car. She hit the leather seats hard, the heavy briefcase tumbling from her grip and spilling across the floorboards. "Stay down," Gabe roared, slamming the heavy steel-reinforced door shut. The lock engaged with a loud mechanical thud, sealing her inside a soundproof vault. Outside, the quiet sanctity of the cemetery shattered. Dominic didn't run for cover. He walked deliberately into the open, moving laterally away from the idling town car. He raised the suppressed Sig Sauer. He wasn't the young, hot-blooded enforcer he had been in his 20s, but the muscle memory of violence never truly degrades. It just waits in the marrow. He fired 3 times. The muffled, mechanical spits of the handgun were immediately answered by the deafening roar of unsuppressed automatic fire. Bullets chewed through the air, completely missing the town car and following Dominic's path. Granite headstones exploded into jagged shrapnel. Mud and wet grass kicked up in violent geysers around his legs. Dominic kept moving, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. He dropped a man leaning out of the passenger side of the lead SUV, then pivoted, putting 2 rounds into the chest of a spotter advancing through the mausoleums. Inside the car, Chloe pressed her hands against her ears, screaming as she watched through the tinted, bullet-resistant glass. She saw the muzzle flashes lighting up the grey afternoon. She saw the man she had hated for a month, trading his life for hers. Second by bloody second, a round caught Dominic in the left shoulder, spinning him backward. He slammed into the base of a weeping angel statue, slipping on the wet grass. He didn't drop the gun. He didn't even yell. He braced his boots against the mud, ignoring the hot, wet spread of blood soaking his overcoat, and kept firing. "Hold on!" Gabe shouted from the driver's seat. He threw the heavy vehicle into drive and floored the accelerator. The town car surged forward, its massive V8 engine roaring over the gunfire. Moretti's men realized what was happening. 2 gunners turned their weapons toward the escaping vehicle. Dominic stepped completely out from behind the Angel. He exposed himself entirely, standing tall in the freezing rain. He emptied the rest of his magazine into the blockade. 1 gunner fell. The front tire of the blocking SUV blew out in a spray of black rubber. It was enough. The armored town car slammed into the crippled SUV at 60 miles an hour. The sickening crunch of twisting steel echoed across the hills. The heavier town car bullied the obstacle aside, scraping along the iron gates, tearing its own bumper completely off before breaking free onto the wet, winding asphalt of the access road. Dominic watched the red tail lights disappear into the fog. A profound, staggering relief washed over him. He had done it. He had paid the debt. Then, the world caved in. A bullet hit him square in the chest, punching the breath from his lungs. A second tore through his stomach. The impact lifted him off his feet and threw him backward into the freezing mud. He slid down the side of a granite slab, his coat leaving a wide, dark smear against the stone. The gunfire abruptly stopped. The ringing silence that followed was heavier than the noise. Dominic's vision began to narrow, the edges turning a fuzzy, static grey. His lungs refused to pull in air. He dropped the empty gun. His right hand trembled as he reached across his ruined chest, gripping his left hand. He felt the heavy gold. He traced his thumb over the cracked onyx stone, feeling the crude silver wire that held the broken pieces together. He thought of the diner, the smell of burnt hash browns, the grey eyes looking at him with such fierce defiance. He thought of Catherine, laughing on a fire escape in 1999, telling him his suits were too expensive for this neighborhood. Dominic leaned his head back against the cold granite. He didn't feel the rain anymore. He just felt warm. He closed his eyes, and the ghost of Chicago finally disappeared. 3 weeks later, a coastal town in Oregon. The rain here was different. It wasn't the harsh, biting sleet of the city. It was a steady, rhythmic drumming against the windows of a small, paid-off cedar house overlooking the grey expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Chloe sat at a modest wooden kitchen table. She wore a thick knitted sweater. The leather briefcase sat open in front of her. Bundles of cash. A passport bearing the name Claire Bennett. A knock at the back door made her jump. She walked slowly to the entryway and pulled back the curtain. She unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. Gabe stood on the porch. He looked entirely out of place in the quiet coastal town. He wore a plain, dark jacket. His left arm was heavily bandaged and strapped into a tight sling. He looked exhausted, aged a decade in a matter of weeks. "Can I come in?" Gabe asked quietly. Chloe stepped aside. Gabe walked into the kitchen. He didn't sit. He reached into his good pocket and pulled out a small, worn velvet pouch. He placed it carefully on the wooden table next to the open briefcase. The family secured the cemetery before the police locked it down, Gabe said, his voice flat, stripped of the rumble it used to carry. I took this before the paramedics arrived. He would have wanted you to have it. Chloe reached out. Her fingers trembled as she untied the string. She tipped the pouch over. The heavy gold ring fell onto the table with a dull clink. The onyx stone was still cracked. The silver wire was still there. It had been cleaned, but deep scratches marred the gold, new scars from a final battle. "What happened to the men who did it?" Chloe asked, staring at the broken stone. "Moretti is dead," Gabe answered simply. "Your father made sure the syndicate's heavy hitters were positioned to gut Moretti's crew before he even stepped out of the car. The war lasted 3 days. There's nobody left to come looking for you. You are completely untraceable." Gabe turned toward the door. He paused, his hand on the knob. "He was a ruthless man, Chloe. He did terrible things," Gabe said, looking out at the rain. "But he loved your mother. And in the end, he traded an empire just to make sure you could breathe." Gabe walked out, pulling the collar of his jacket up against the damp wind. Chloe sat alone in the quiet house. She picked up the ring. It was far too large for her fingers. She slipped it onto a thin silver chain she wore around her neck, letting the heavy gold settle against her chest, right over her heart. She looked out the window at the vast, unending ocean. She was finally safe. She was finally a ghost, and for the first time in her life, she was ready to live. Dominic paid the ultimate price to give his daughter the life he had stolen from her mother. Blood washed away with blood, leaving Chloe to build a future from the ashes of his empire. Did Dominic truly redeem himself in the end? Or was his sacrifice too little, too late? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If this gritty, emotional mafia story kept you hooked, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next original drama. Share this video with someone who loves a story of sacrifice and redemption.